April 9th, 1947, Woodward, Oklahoma. At around 8:40 in the evening, the city was living an ordinary life. People were returning home. Some were still visiting friends or finishing errands. Families were preparing for the night. The sky was dark. Low clouds covered the horizon, and almost no one could see what was already approaching the city. At 8:42, everything changed. Out of the darkness came a sound that survivors would later compare to the roar of a speeding freight train. But there were no warning sirens like the ones people know today. There were no television alerts, no radar image on a phone, no message arriving 10 or 20 minutes before impact. Woodward faced the deadliest tornado ever to strike Oklahoma, almost completely blind. And the most disturbing part was that by then, the storm had already destroyed other communities. The catastrophe had been moving toward Woodward for hours, yet the city still knew almost nothing about it.
That morning did not look like the beginning of a historic disaster. Across the Texas Panhandle, low clouds and patches of thick fog covered the landscape, while the air remained relatively cool. The morning forecast in Amarillo called for cloudy conditions with some clearing and temperatures near 60 degrees Fahrenheit. But during the afternoon, the clouds began to break apart. Sunlight heated the surface more than expected, and the atmosphere rapidly became more dangerous. Across the Great Plains, warm, moist air, a cold front, powerful winds aloft, and an area of low pressure were coming together. Today, meteorologists would recognize that combination as an alarming setup for organized rotating thunderstorms.
But in 1947, the observation network was sparse. Computer models did not exist, and public tornado forecasting was still almost forbidden territory. Forecasters often avoided using the word tornado because officials feared panic or the loss of public trust if a warning turned out to be wrong. The sky was becoming more dangerous, but there was almost no system capable of turning that danger into a warning people could actually use. The first chapter of the disaster began far southwest of Woodward. During the afternoon, the storm system produced a series of tornadoes moving across Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas. For decades, the disaster was often described as one extraordinary tornado that traveled for more than 200 miles. Later research revealed a more complicated picture. It was most likely a family of at least 5 or 6 separate tornadoes. But the main tornado was still extraordinarily long-lived. It remained on the ground for roughly 100 miles. At around 7 in the evening, it struck the tiny Texas community of Glazier and almost erased it. Only a handful of structures survived. Then came Higgins. The business district was devastated, and roughly half of the town's homes were destroyed. Dozens of people had already died before the storm even crossed into Oklahoma. And ahead of it lay Woodward. The tornado was moving northeast at tremendous speed, while darkness became one of its greatest advantages. Low clouds, fog, and night made the funnel almost impossible to see. At times, people could glimpse its shape only when lightning illuminated the sky. When the tornado entered Oklahoma, it did not weaken the way people farther along its path might have hoped. It passed near Shattuck, Gage, and Fargo, destroying farms and ranches along the way. Near Gage, observers could already hear its enormous roar from several miles away. Near Arnett, one man could hear the tornado, but could not see it because the clouds were hanging so low. What was approaching Woodward was not a narrow funnel like the one seen in familiar photographs. It was a vast, rotating zone of destruction. Later surveys showed that inside the city, the damage path reached roughly 1.8 miles across, almost 3 kilometers. The tornado was moving so quickly that the distance between the last peaceful moments and catastrophe was shrinking by the minute. And this is where the story becomes even more frightening. Woodward was not simply in the path of a powerful tornado. It was in the path of a storm that would later be retrospectively rated at the maximum level, an F5 on the Fujita scale. And the people of Woodward received no official tornado warning at all. For many of them, the first real sign of danger was not a forecast or a siren. It was the growing roar coming out of the darkness. At 8:42 in the evening, the tornado slammed into the western and northern sections of Woodward. At first, the wind tore away roofs and shattered windows. Then, entire houses began to collapse down to their foundations. Boards, sheets of metal, glass, and pieces of buildings became airborne weapons. Investigators later found wooden splinters driven into walls, roofing material wrapped around poles, and heavy structures twisted beyond recognition inside the zone of maximum destruction. More than 100 city blocks were devastated. Over 1,000 homes and businesses were destroyed, and nearly 1,000 people were injured. But the disaster did not end with the first impact. Electrical lines and telephone lines were torn apart. Equipment at the local weather station was destroyed. Normal communication with the outside world disappeared. Fires broke out across several parts of the city.
And then another problem became clear. Fighting those fires was extremely difficult because the water system had been damaged and almost every available person was needed to search for the injured and the dead. About 15 minutes later, heavy rain helped suppress some of the flames. A city that had been ordinary only minutes earlier was now isolated, dark, and buried beneath debris. The most painful stories from that night cannot be reduced to statistics. The tornado struck early in the evening when many families were separated. Some people were at home, others were still in town, others were returning later. People came back to their streets and discovered that their houses no longer existed. The family of a local Weather Bureau observer survived because they managed to reach a storm cellar. Others were not as fortunate. Reports from the time describe widespread confusion as relatives searched for one another through hospitals, temporary aid stations, and piles of wreckage.
3 children who were killed could never be identified. Another child survived the tornado but became separated from his family in the chaos and, according to the National Weather Service, was never reunited with them. Help began arriving from other cities, including Oklahoma City and Wichita. Rescue workers and volunteers searched through the darkness, moving across streets filled with debris where every pile of boards could hide someone still alive. And all of this was happening without the modern disaster response system that people today assume will exist when a major emergency begins. When daylight came, the full scale of the destruction finally became visible. In Woodward and the surrounding area, at least 107 people were killed. Across Oklahoma, at least 116 people died. To this day, the Woodward tornado remains the deadliest tornado in the history of the state. Before reaching Oklahoma, the storm had already destroyed Glazier and much of Higgins in Texas. Farther northeast, it continued damaging homes in Woods County. Historical reports give slightly different totals for the entire tornado outbreak because record-keeping and storm analysis in 1947 were far less precise than they are today. But even the most conservative figures reveal the scale. More than 100 people dead along the path, hundreds injured, and well over 1,000 structures destroyed or damaged. And several days later, conditions became even worse for survivors. Temperatures fell sharply. Cold rain turned into snow. People whose homes had lost roofs and windows now faced another threat after the wind was already gone. The tornado itself lasted only minutes in Woodward. For the people left behind, the catastrophe was only beginning. Woodward also left behind another legacy, one that cannot be seen in the old photographs of ruined streets. In 1947, Americans were essentially living in an era before the modern tornado warning system. The following year, at Tinker Air Force Base in Oklahoma, Ernest Fawbush and Robert Miller successfully forecast tornado conditions in advance, one of the first breakthroughs of its kind. Soon afterward, the Weather Bureau began developing a centralized system for forecasting severe storms. By 1953, a formal tornado observation and warning program was being established. The National Weather Service connects that transformation not only to improving post-war technology, but also to tragedies like Woodward, and other deadly tornadoes of the late 1940s and early 1950s. That is why the story of Woodward is not only about the terrifying power of wind, it is also about the value of a few minutes of information. That night, Woodward did not have those minutes. Today, radar, forecasts, sirens, and the decision to take shelter in time can separate an ordinary evening from a mass casualty disaster. And the memory of Woodward helps explain why those minutes matter so much.